You walk into a respectable European pharmacy in the 17th century, the kind of shop with neat rows of labeled jars, a trained apothecary behind the counter, patrons in fine clothing waiting their turn. You ask for something to ease chronic pain, or stop internal bleeding, or treat a seizure. The apothecary reaches for a jar, and inside it, ground into a fine brown powder, is human being. Not symbolically, not as a figure of speech. Actual, pulverized human remains. Sold legally, prescribed by physicians, purchased by royalty, and considered, for centuries, genuinely good medicine. This isn't a fringe practice from some remote, poorly documented corner of history. It was mainstream, widespread, and it lasted for an almost unbelievable stretch of time. A quick note before we get into it. This video covers documented medical history involving human remains as a factual, historical topic, presented with the seriousness it deserves, not for shock value. Let's start with the substance that gave this entire practice its name, because the story of how it got that name is almost as strange as the practice itself. Mumia, sometimes called mumia, originally referred to bitumen, a naturally occurring tar-like substance that ancient and medieval physicians believed had genuine medicinal properties, useful for wounds, bruising, and internal ailments. Somewhere along the way, medieval European traders and physicians became aware that ancient Egyptian embalmers had used a substance resembling bitumen in the mummification process. Through a chain of assumption, mistranslation, and increasingly confident medical tradition, European physicians concluded that Egyptian mummies themselves, having been treated with this substance, must therefore contain concentrated medicinal properties. The logic, by modern standards, falls apart almost immediately, but within the medical framework of the time, it held together well enough to launch an enormous and sustained trade. By the 12th century, European demand for mumia had grown substantial enough that a genuine commercial industry developed specifically to supply it. Merchants traveled to Egypt, purchased or excavated mummified remains, and shipped ground or whole mummy material back to European pharmacies. The German physician and writer Johannes Actuarius, and later numerous other medical authorities across the following centuries, prescribed mumia for an extraordinary range of conditions: epilepsy, internal bleeding, bruising, paralysis, coughing up blood, and general vague weakness. This wasn't a hidden or embarrassing practice conducted in secret. It appeared in official pharmacopoeias, the standardized reference guides physicians and apothecaries used to determine legitimate, approved treatments, listed alongside herbal remedies and mineral compounds as an accepted part of mainstream European medicine. Here's where the story gets genuinely uncomfortable, because demand eventually outpaced the actual supply of ancient Egyptian mummies available for this purpose, and the market responded exactly the way markets tend to respond to a supply shortage, with fraud, and then with something considerably darker. Historical records describe merchants beginning to use the bodies of recently deceased individuals, executed criminals, plague victims, unclaimed corpses, treating and drying them to artificially resemble ancient Egyptian mummies before selling them into the same medical trade. Some historical accounts even describe reports of grave robbing specifically to meet demand for this manufactured product. The French surgeon Ambroise Paré, writing in the 16th century, one of the most respected medical figures of his era, expressed genuine skepticism about the practice, not primarily on ethical grounds by the standards of his time, but because he suspected much of what was being sold as authentic ancient mumia was fraudulent, freshly prepared corpses being passed off as centuries-old Egyptian remains to unsuspecting buyers paying premium prices for authenticity that didn't exist. Now, let's talk about a related but distinct practice. Because mumia wasn't the only form human remains took in ancient and early modern medicine, and one specific application reveals something particularly disturbing about how directly and immediately this practice was tied to actual violent death. Across multiple European countries well into the 17th and even 18th centuries, a specific and widely documented practice involved what was sometimes called corpse medicine derived directly from public executions. Fresh human blood, taken directly from recently executed individuals at public executions, was believed by many physicians and ordinary people alike to have genuine curative properties, particularly for epilepsy. Historical accounts, including documented cases from Denmark, Germany, and other parts of Europe, describe sick individuals or their family members on their behalf, attending public executions specifically to drink blood while it was still warm, believing the life force or vital energy of the executed person could be transferred directly into the ailing patient. This wasn't a fringe superstition practiced by a small, uneducated minority. Physicians of the era, working within the accepted medical theory of the time, which held that blood carried vital, transferable properties, genuinely endorsed and sometimes facilitated this practice as legitimate treatment. Human fat, rendered specifically from executed criminals, was similarly used across parts of early modern Europe as an ingredient in ointments believed to treat joint pain, rheumatism, and various skin conditions. Executioners themselves, in several documented European contexts, developed something close to a secondary income supplying these preparations directly, since they had unique, legal access to freshly deceased bodies, as part of their official duties. This detail matters, because it shows the practice wasn't hidden or shameful within its own historical context. It was integrated directly into the formal, legal, and medical infrastructure of the societies practicing it, with executioners occupying a recognized, if grim, supply role within an accepted medical economy. Let's step back now and ask the harder, more uncomfortable question underneath all of this, because simply cataloging these practices without examining the reasoning behind them misses what actually makes this history worth understanding rather than just being shocked by. Why did intelligent, trained physicians across multiple independent European countries, over a span of roughly 500 years, genuinely believe that human remains had medicinal value? The answer lies in the dominant medical theory of the era, sometimes called sympathetic medicine, or the doctrine of signatures, the belief that substances could transfer their inherent properties directly to a patient through consumption or application. Under this framework, human remains represented, in a sense, the most direct and potent possible medicine available, because what could more perfectly restore human vitality than human vitality itself, harvested directly from another body? This wasn't considered cannibalism in the way the ancient and early modern mind categorized it. It was categorized instead alongside other medicinal substances derived from animal or mineral sources, evaluated purely on its believed therapeutic properties rather than through any framework resembling modern ethical or nutritional categories. This matters for understanding the broader pattern because it connects directly to something this channel has covered repeatedly across other videos: ancient and early modern medicine operating almost entirely through trial, observation, and inherited theoretical frameworks, with essentially no capacity to distinguish a genuinely effective treatment from an elaborate, sincerely believed placebo. Physicians prescribing mumia weren't cynically defrauding their patients in most documented cases. Many appeared to have genuinely believed, within the medical logic available to them, that they were providing real, effective treatment. The same sincere but scientifically unfounded confidence that led ancient and medieval physicians to prescribe mercury, believing it treated the very conditions it was actually causing. A pattern we've covered in detail on this channel before. Let's also address something important for historical accuracy here, because this practice needs to be distinguished clearly from something it sometimes gets conflated with in popular retellings. This wasn't primarily about a desire to consume drugs for altered consciousness or recreational effect, the way most substances covered on this channel are. This was medicine, understood within its own historical context, applied with the same seriousness and clinical intent that a modern physician applies to a prescribed pharmaceutical. The disturbing part isn't that ancient people were seeking intoxication or spiritual experience through this practice. It's that respected medical authorities, operating in good faith within the best available knowledge of their era, genuinely believed human remains represented legitimate, effective treatment, and that belief persisted stubbornly for centuries, even as more effective alternatives gradually became available. So when did this actually stop? The decline was gradual, rather than sudden, tracking roughly alongside the broader rise of empirical, evidence-based medicine across the 18th century. As physicians increasingly demanded observable, testable evidence for why a treatment worked, rather than accepting inherited theoretical frameworks about sympathetic transfer of vital properties, corpse-derived medicines gradually fell out of mainstream medical practice. Mumia, specifically lingered in some European pharmacies into the 18th, and even, in isolated cases, the 19th century. A slow fade, rather than a dramatic single moment of medical reckoning, with some historical accounts suggesting certain preparations remained available for purchase in parts of Europe as late as the early 20th century, sold more as a curiosity or a lingering folk remedy than as a serious mainstream treatment by that point. There's a broader pattern worth drawing out here before we close, because this connects directly to something this entire channel keeps circling back to across every video we've made about ancient and early modern medicine. The line between medicine and something we now find genuinely disturbing was never a fixed, obvious boundary. It shifted constantly, based entirely on the best theoretical framework available at any given moment in history, applied with complete sincerity by people who had no way of knowing which parts of their accepted medical knowledge would eventually be viewed as sound science, and which parts would eventually be viewed as something closer to horror. Mercury seemed like reasonable, aggressive treatment for syphilis for centuries. Bloodletting seemed like sound medical logic for even longer. Mumia, corpse medicine, and the broader theoretical framework that justified them fit into exactly this same pattern, treatments that made complete internal sense within their era's understanding of how the human body worked, understanding that later, more rigorous science would eventually, and thoroughly, overturn.